It's 2 in the morning and you're not asleep. You're in a conversation that will never happen. Maybe it's the thing you should have said to someone 3 years ago that you didn't. Maybe it's a confrontation you've been rehearsing so long that you know every version of it, including the versions where it goes wrong, and the versions where it goes perfectly, and the versions where the other person finally understands and says exactly what you needed to hear. Maybe it's something that hasn't happened yet but might. A job interview, a difficult conversation, a moment where someone finally sees you clearly. And you're running it, and rerunning it, and adjusting the details, and running it again. And at some point you fall asleep inside a scene your brain invented entirely that will almost certainly never occur, that felt more real than the room you were lying in. If that's you, you're not broken. You're not delusional, and you are definitely not alone. Stay till the end. Because what's actually happening inside that imagined conversation is more psychologically sophisticated than almost anyone has ever told you. Let's start with what the research actually says. Because popular explanations for this pattern tend to land in one of two places. Either it's framed as a harmless quirk, just a daydreamer, nothing to worry about. Or it's framed as a problem, anxiety, rumination, something to fix. Neither of those captures what's really going on. Psychologist Jerome Singer at Yale spent decades studying mental imagery and what he called positive, constructive fantasy. And what he found consistently was that people who engage in elaborate, self-directed mental scenarios, the kind with emotional logic, narrative structure, and specific characters, tend to score higher on measures of creative problem-solving, emotional regulation, and what researchers call psychological flexibility. The ability to hold multiple perspectives and outcomes simultaneously. The imagined conversation isn't a symptom of something going wrong. In most cases, it's evidence of a mind doing something genuinely sophisticated. Now let's talk about what the scenario is actually doing, because it's not random. Psychologists studying pre-sleep mental activity have identified a specific window right before you fall asleep called the hypnagogic state. During this window, the rational, analytical parts of your brain start to quiet down before the emotional parts do. And in that gap, what surfaces is almost always emotionally significant. The things that were pushed aside during the day because there was no time or space to feel them fully start rising back up. And your brain, being the story machine it is, doesn't just replay those things. It builds scenarios around them. It creates narrative containers for emotional content that didn't get processed anywhere else that day. The imagined scenario where you finally say the thing you never said. The confrontation where the other person finally understands. The version of the relationship that worked out the way it should have. These aren't fantasies in the escapist sense. They're your mind doing emotional maintenance work in the only space where it feels safe enough to do it. Alone, in the dark, without an audience. Here's something worth slowing down for, because it changes how you see the whole pattern. The scenarios people return to most consistently are never truly random. Research by G. William Domhoff on dream content and mental imagery consistently found that the themes people return to in their imagined scenarios closely mirror their most unresolved emotional concerns. Not their biggest fears necessarily, their deepest unfinished business. The conversation you keep rehearsing with a parent. The version of a relationship that ended badly where this time someone takes responsibility. The moment where you finally say what you actually think instead of what you thought was acceptable. These scenarios are targeting something. They're your nervous system circling the same location over and over because something there hasn't been fully processed yet. The scenario isn't the problem. It's a map. And the location it keeps returning to is where the real work is. Pause here for a second, because this is the part of this pattern that almost nobody talks about directly. People who imagine elaborate false scenarios are almost always people whose emotional reality didn't have adequate space somewhere. Not necessarily through dramatic trauma, sometimes through something quieter. A household where certain feelings weren't welcomed. Relationships where the full version of you was too much or not enough. A life where the gap between what you actually thought and what was acceptable to say out loud became wide enough that your interior world had to develop its own infrastructure for processing what the exterior world couldn't hold. The imagined conversation isn't just rehearsal, it's compensation. Your mind building privately what the environment around you didn't provide publicly. A space where the things you felt were allowed to be felt fully. Where the things you needed to say could be said without consequence. Where the outcome you deserved but didn't receive was allowed to exist, at least somewhere. That's not delusion, that's resourcefulness. Now let's talk about the version of this that deserves more honest attention. Because not every imagined scenario is doing the same work. There are imagined scenarios that are genuinely constructive. They process old pain, rehearse future situations, and allow the emotional mind to find resolution it can bring back into waking life. The person who runs the imagined conversation and then wakes up knowing more clearly what they actually feel. The person who rehearses a difficult interaction and then has it in real life with more honesty than they would have without the rehearsal. And then there are imagined scenarios that have become something else. Not processing, but avoidance. Not rehearsal, but substitution. The scenario that feels more satisfying than reality, to the point where reality becomes the lesser version. The imagined victory that quietly becomes a replacement for pursuing the actual thing. The imagined conversation that happens so many times that the real one never has to. The difference is in what the scenario produces. If the imagined conversation eventually leads somewhere, to more clarity, to a real conversation, to a better understanding of what you actually want, it's doing what it's supposed to do. If it stays entirely contained in the imagined space, and the real situation never moves because the imagined version is enough, something has shifted. One is your mind using imagination the way it was built to be used. The other is your mind using imagination the way it was built to be used, but in a direction that started to work against you. Here's what researchers have found about the people who do this most intensely. The ones with the most elaborate and emotionally detailed imagined worlds tend to be people with unusually high levels of what psychologists call affect intensity, the tendency to experience emotions more strongly and with greater complexity than average. For these people, the interior world isn't a refuge from emotion. It's where their most intense emotional life actually lives. And the interior world develops in inverse proportion to how much space the exterior world provided. The less room there was in the real environment for the full emotional experience, the richer and more detailed the interior world became. Which means the people with the most elaborate imagined scenarios are very often the people who had the most to say and the fewest places it was safe to say it. So what do you do with this? You start by taking the scenario seriously. Not as a problem to eliminate, but as information. Every imagined conversation has a subject. Every rehearsed confrontation has a core. Every replayed interaction is circling something specific. The question worth asking is not why am I doing this, but what is this trying to do? And then you ask whether the imagined version is moving toward the real one or away from it. Whether the clarity you're finding in your head is starting to find its way into actual conversations, actual decisions, actual expression. Or whether the interior world has become complete enough that the exterior world stopped needing to change. Because the mind that built that interior world, the one that runs the scenarios and adjusts the dialogue and knows exactly what it needed and didn't get, that mind is not the problem. That mind is one of the most emotionally intelligent things about you. The only question worth asking it is whether the conversation it keeps practicing is one it's ever going to be allowed to have out loud. Not because you owe that to anyone, but because you've spent a long time saying the right things in the dark. And maybe some of them are finally ready for the light. If this video described you more accurately than you expected, please subscribe. I would genuinely appreciate it.